So I'm going to start by saying that this is joint research with Alva Taylor, who is at the Tuck School of Business. And I'm also going to ask you, since we have an hour and a half, to go ahead and interrupt me with questions throughout. I'm going to be covering a lot of ground today, from crowdfunding to different aspects of learning. So you can go ahead and raise a hand. I'll definitely be able to pick up. So we're going to do this like a reverse murder mystery, starting with the big takeaways. First, entrepreneurs do not learn from their own failure. They actually only learn from watching other entrepreneurs fail. Second, entrepreneurs are able to learn from their success, whether or not they're experiencing it themselves or watching it in other entrepreneurs. And third, when it is not obvious what choices are leading to success, it is definitely better to observe than to experience. Ideally, you should be doing both. But if you can only do one or the other due to limited resources, strangely enough, it's actually better to watch. Okay, so that seems pretty strange, right? So how do we get there? First, we start with two premises. The first is that understanding organizational learning in startups, especially tech startups, is something really important that we should care about. And the second is that early stage entrepreneurs do learn not only from their own experience, but constantly from all of their interactions with the other startups around them, and that this happens more and more in recent years. So to that first point, in the last few years, startups in the US are actually experiencing a decline. And this is not only as a proportion of total businesses, but in total numbers. Part of this is because we're seeing earlier exits, and part of this is because less people are starting startups. There are a lot of different reasons, but one reason why we should be concerned is because startups are the primary driver of job growth in the US economy. They add an average of 3 million jobs a year, while established companies reduce jobs by about 1 million per year. And this has been true from 1977 all the way until 2005. Now, to that second point, also in the last maybe 5 to 10 years, we've seen a proliferation of different types of institutional contexts where startups are coming together. Everybody knows in Silicon Valley about all the incubators and the accelerators and the co-working spaces. We have co-founder dating. We have portfolio companies that come together in all different types of contexts. And what this means is that startups are more and more aware of the outcomes of other startups, the strategies of other startups, and the business innovations, as well as the technological innovations. Now this, I think, is a really unparalleled opportunity. We know that they are doing lots and lots of learning, and we should be trying to understand whether that learning is working for them, not working for them, and in which context. So that brings me to the big research question that drives this study and the two studies that come after it, which is, how does this entrepreneurial learning from all this type of past history that is available to them, their own past history and all the past history of the other startups that they can see, now driving performance outcomes in startups, particularly with funding? Okay, so going back to what we already know, in general, there have been about 3 decades of research and organizational learning, and a lot of it does apply to an entrepreneurial context. We can group it into these 3 categories. So we know that knowledge acquisition is important because this is going to help us map cause and effect. We can build a cognitive map of how the world works, particularly in our industry, and then we can move on to problem solving and try to figure out how to take all of that information from our cognitive map and identify which challenges are going to be important. Finally, once we've done that, we can try to encode that into new routines in our organization and new skills and capabilities. So basically, we have all this different type of information that's coming into the firm and all of these different processes that we're going to try to turn into strategies. But what we don't know is, how does this differ with information that we're getting outside of the firm versus information that we already have inside of the firm? What do we really know about vicarious learning when it comes to organizations? Now, in the field of psychology, there's lots of work in observational learning where we see individuals who are looking at other individuals. But when it comes to organizations, in the past, it's been very hard to know what they can see and what they can't see, right? We know that we are always looking at the news media and people are following the stocks of other people, but it's hard to quantify this and it's hard to measure it. And that's why generally in studies we see that there's going to be more work on direct experience because we can record what's happening inside the firm. And just because it's much easier not only to identify the internal learning, but to isolate it, to say, okay, this was an instance of learning and this was an instance of learning. And when it's happening outside the firm, we have this problem of trying to get the signal out of the noise. And that means that when we do have work on vicarious learning, it's typically going to be what I call vicarious catastrophic learning. So you can see some examples of previous studies here. We have cardiac surgeries, orbital launches, those are rocket launches, train wrecks, coal mining, and failed M&A. Yes? Yes. So vicarious learning is that observational learning. It's that learning that you're getting indirectly by watching the experiences of others. So going back to our catastrophic experiences here, one of the problems with having all of the studies come from situations like this is that when you're comparing success to failure, success here is when you didn't have a train wreck. So success becomes something like years of operating experience without a train wreck. So we're not really getting an apples to apples comparison. And we also don't get a bounded experience, if you will, right? Because you just have this ongoing span of years and you can't really say, this was that success experience. And that is a real problem. And the other reason why it can be very problematic to study catastrophe is because it impacts us emotionally in a different way than our everyday failures do. So when an organization doesn't get funding or a contract doesn't go through, this doesn't necessarily become a memorable experience that's going to be in the news and impact us emotionally for the rest of our lives the way that a huge coal mining accident will. So it's important for us to have studies where success is actually a celebratory experience, as it would be in the real world, and failure does not always mean life or death. Okay, so what is going to be a good way of measuring vicarious learning in startups and other organizations? My co-author and I found that crowdfunding is actually the perfect window for studying organizational behavior. Now, for anybody in the room that's not familiar with crowdfunding, the basic process is this. You have a large number of different investors, and these don't have to be accredited investors, just ordinary people who are interested in a product or a project that's being offered. And you have an internet platform whose job is to aggregate those funds. Then you have the project set some kind of funding goal. So there are projects that set funding goals where if you don't reach them, you still get the money. But in this study, we're going to be looking at Kickstarter, which requires you to actually reach the funding goal. So we're just going to assume that once the investor's money is aggregated and the funding goal is reached, then we see the funds going to the project. We see the production of something, whether it's a widget or some kind of other project, and then the returns go back to the investors, usually in the form of a physical reward. So here, rather than seeing it as typical ROI, it's going to be kind of like a product pre-order. Now, why is crowdfunding such a great learning window? Basically, you can see this online platform as a fixed community where every relationship is preserved in the form of comments and outcomes, basically for all time, which is amazing because we have a record of everything that happened and when it happened, and we can see all of the different interactions between these large networks of organizations that are typically all at kind of an early stage level. What's also great is that these days, particularly in the last couple of years, crowdfunding has become a really mainstream source of seed capital. So in the early days, it'd be easy to say, I don't really know if this is generalizable, right? Because how does this compare to the way that VCs do their business? Are people who are backers on a crowdfunding platform really making their decisions the same way that a VC firm does? Recent studies show that actually, in the tech categories, they do. So this high likelihood here that campaigns within tech categories will transition into ongoing ventures is actually above 80%. So I would say that it really is comparable data. It's very generalizable to what happens in the Silicon Valley world. And also, we're only seeing that crowdfunding is just exploding more and more. You can see that figure, 34.4 billion last year, and that's double from that 16.2 billion in 2014. I'm pretty sure that in 2016, it's probably going to be double, because when I look at the figures, it's still exponential growth. Okay, so how is it exactly that crowdfunding data allows us to record and measure this behavior? We not only have that codification I talked about, all those interactions and comments between those creators and those backers, but we have a way to see which projects were successful and which projects are failed. Because when projects fail on Kickstarter, they do become harder to find on the platform, but they don't actually go away as a record. And so we're able to see, going all the way back, not just which projects you had that failed, but which projects you watched that failed. So in terms of using Kickstarter particularly as a learning window for our study, the reason that we chose it is because it is by far the largest crowdfunding platform in the world, and the one which is the most likely to have technology ventures that become ongoing firms. Kickstarter is really, really big. It has $2.8 billion in funding. It's a lot more than I thought. And that statistic there is actually from this morning, because when I last updated these slides, it was 2.2 billion just a couple months ago. That's how fast this is growing. And you can see that that came from 11 million backers, 3 million of which were repeat backers. So people do come to the platform over and over to try to understand industries that they're in, particularly growing industries like 3D printing. And what is it exactly that you can see on Kickstarter? This is where we get into the real meat of what an amazing opportunity this is. So for this study alone, I was able to capture 50 to 80 different variables for each different project, not all of which we had to use, but it meant that we were able to control the data very, very carefully. We were able to control for regional location down to the city. We were able to control for whether or not it was a staff pick. We were able to control for currency, what year the currency was. We had 9 different currencies, which we corrected for 6 different years. It is definitely the most carefully controlled learning study of its kind. And that's because of the richness of data like this. We see that there are more and more crowdfunding platforms in Asia and other regions of the world that have data that is just as rich as this. So at the end of this talk, I'd love to talk about what other opportunities there might be to see how this kind of work can extend beyond the US. Because although the data in this study is international, it's something like 70, 80% US projects. So I would say that the results are very US driven. Now, because of the richness of that data, we can literally do a perfect comparison between the experience that you have yourself and the experience that you watch in others. It's pretty much the opposite of that situation where we're comparing a train wreck to years of operating experience. So here, for every project we have where we can see what came before that project, we can also see what they watched before that project. So I'm just going to take a minute to go over that again because it can be a little bit confusing. In our sample, we have what we call focal projects. So these are the projects that are happening in what you could call real time right now. And then we peek into their past over 6 years. So we see at any point in the data set, in year 3, what did you have that came before year 3? Or if you're a focal project in year 4, what did you experience before year 4? And we have to correct for each year of the data set to make sure that we're updating if that project appears in the data set again. And the same thing goes for the vicarious experience for every year of the data set. Yes?
So it sounds like you're measuring learning by change in performance and indications by change in performance. Is that correct, or are you measuring them differently?
So what we're doing is we're looking at funding outcomes for the focal project. So we measure just one time for the focal projects whether they got funding or not, but by looking at their prior histories, we can see, okay, if you're a focal project that came out of year 3 and you had 3 prior projects and no projects that you watched, what was your rate of funding success? Or sorry, did you get funded or not? Or if you're a project that came out of the last year and you had several years of watching other projects, but this was your first project, did you get funded or not? So it can be a little bit confusing because the focal projects come from different years, so we have to do some complicated corrections across time. But in the end, we're able to figure out with our different populations, the ones who never watched anything but only did, the ones that did something but never watched, the ones that did both, the ones that did neither, what the differences in their likelihood of getting funding are.
And what exactly is watched? What do you mean by watched?
Watched would be that they had backed a project. So if I'm a Kickstarter creator and I've backed a project, it means that I went and I put some of my funding dollars into their project, which then gave me better access. I then got the right to interact with the people in that project. I could write on their wall, I could see their updates. And a lot of people do this because if you're somebody who, say, is going to launch in the 3D printing industry for the first time, and you really don't know whether you're entering a new niche or whether it's more of like an incremental innovation, what you're doing, then the best way for you to research that is to become a backer of other projects, because the level at which you can back is very low. Most of these projects offer something like $5 or less as their lowest backing level, and you don't get a product for that, but what you get is the chance to be part of their community. What they're hoping is that they will convert you for the future. So this time around, you give $5 and you get information about what kind of company they are and what they're doing, and next time around, you back at a much higher level so that you can get their product. It's a pretty winning strategy, so a lot of people do it in a lot of different categories. Okay, so this brings us to one of our biggest challenges. Kickstarter, being very, very big, has a lot of stuff on it that is definitely not ventures, right? So how do we make sure that we're not recording this and that we're getting this? Not this being a dance, film, photography project thing, and this, which we want, being a game stick, a piece of hardware, which is something that's much more likely to be the type of venture that we want to look at. So here what we did is come up with our own Kickstarter category, which we called gear because hardware was already taken. But if hardware hadn't been taken, we probably would have just called it that. So gear is a combined category that contains technologically based and physically manufactured products that are designed for some kind of function. Now, the reason we want to have things that are physically manufactured is because we don't want to get into that fuzzy category of apps and things that are very blurry. We want to know that the supply chain is going to be pretty similar for the types of companies that we're looking at, that they all have to deal with sourcing, production, and delivery, and that they have similar kinds of challenges. So in our subcategories, we ended up with 10, because when we looked at technology, we didn't want to include things like robots, where it turns out that you get robot plush toys and robot comic books and robot tabletop games. We actually had to go through and hand code parts of the data to make sure that the vast majority of projects in the categories that we chose really do belong in gear. So there was a lot of work up front, just reading Kickstarter project after Kickstarter project and trying to figure out, when a person is deciding what category their product belongs in, how do they choose and what does it mean to them? Because I personally would have thought that robots means a device, but it turns out that that is definitely not what it means to a lot of people. And another similar category, flight, I would have thought that that was much fuzzier, that flight could be something like books on flight. But it turns out that flight is really specifically for flight-related gadgets. So only by going through the data at a fine-grained level do we really see how people are interacting with that platform. So this is what we ended up with. We collected data from Kickstarter's inception in 2009 all the way until mid-2014. So we got 6 years of data, and our final sample contained 3,071 of these focal projects. I deleted projects from the sample when they had a funding goal that was under $100, because that would basically be meaningless, kind of like a a hobby or joke kind of thing. And I also deleted other types of outliers that our statistical analysis showed didn't constitute an actual population, but were just, I guess you could say, people being quirky or weird. But that only ended up being a couple hundred projects out of thousands of projects. So we were pretty lucky that the sample captures a lot of that mini population. We also have a much larger database that we can get all of that prior history. So for instance, if you launched in 3D printing in gear, but you previously watched a project that was in dance, we managed to capture that because we crawled 250,000 projects from Kickstarter, which I'm pretty sure was 99% of the population at the time that we crawled it. So lots and lots of data munging there. Now you can see that our sample is fairly skewed. This is because of that explosive growth in crowdfunding that I was talking about. So in 2009, crowdfunding was very nascent. People were sort of hesitant to put that kind of risk in there. But in 2014, you can see that it's really taken off. The only reason that we see a decline in 2015 is because our data stops in 2014, and we just have a few that scraped in that might have ended just over the cusp, right? Like funding started in 2014, but they delivered a product in 2015. So I would just assume that it ends kind of here at the peak. Now you can see when looking at our unique campaign teams that the vast majority only have launched once. Something like 15% have a prior launching history, but a much larger number have a prior watching history. We'll get to that in a moment. First, a little fun fact that I think is kind of useful for the room. 15%, a not insignificant percentage of the products that are in this category have something to do with Arduinos. Arduinos are sort of like a dumb Raspberry Pi. And if you're not familiar with what a Raspberry Pi is, a Raspberry Pi is sort of like a mini computing device, whereas an Arduino is one step below a computer. It's a microcontroller that allows you to manipulate different types of devices such as sensors. It's a building block, and it's growing more and more. People are creating new attachments to Arduinos. It's a whole mini movement in and of itself that I think that we should be watching. Okay, so how do we actually compare the performance impact of all of this watching versus this doing? First, going back to our sample, 15% of those teams have previous direct experience. So that's what I was referring to with the campaign teams mostly having just the focal launch. But almost half of them have previously watched a project before the focal project. And 10.27% have done both. These are pretty good numbers for a study like this. Typically, when you're looking at catastrophic failure or something like that, you're comparing something that happens 1 in 1,000 times. So we're pretty happy with these kinds of balances in our data. Now, in terms of measuring performance, for this particular study, we looked at funding outcomes. But for our 2 future studies, we'll be looking at whether they actually managed to deliver on a project, and if they didn't, where in the supply chain did they run into trouble. But here, it's easiest to just start with yes or no, did they manage to get the capital that they asked for or not? So step 1 was just looking at all of that direct experience versus all of that vicarious experience. And this lets us kind of get this baseline comparison where devoid of context, we just see, is watching useful and is doing useful? Do either of them contribute to performance? Then in step 2, we try to think about real-life contexts and break them down into 2 different dimensions. So here, we break them down into success and failure. So we got our 4 different categories: success that you experienced, failure that you experienced, success that you watched, and failure that you watched. And then we have related and unrelated. So this would be comparable to looking out of industry and in industry. So it would be projects that you had outside of gear, projects that you launched inside gear, projects that you watched outside of gear, projects that you watched inside gear. Okay, so what is actually driving our predictions about what is better? In a nutshell, our theory is that what you want direct experience for is honing your existing skills and capabilities. If you're already on a good path, then direct experience is going to help you strengthen that path that you're on. It's going to help you build that tacit knowledge that you have within the organization. But one big challenge with direct experience is that it's subject to what we call attribution bias. So in a nutshell, this is that when I have a success, I assume it's because I'm so incredibly awesome. It must be because of me and my personal qualities. But when I have a failure, it's the external environment. It can't be me, it's something that happened to me. So I spend all of my energy not trying to think about how I personally can improve. I try to consider how I'm going to spin this. How am I going to explain which aspect of the external environment got in my way and created a barrier? With vicarious experience, this is really not so much the case, because when you're watching somebody else fail, you are not their spin doctor. You don't have to worry too much about the story that you're going to have to come up with, and you are very much aware if it was their personal failure or not, even watching from a distance. So vicarious experience allows us not only to have a much more objective comparison, but it's also better for those kinds of ambiguous cases where you're not sure what happened, because often you can be vicariously observing two different projects at once. When you're experiencing something, you're very much in it. You have what's called bounded rationality, where you're only capable of dealing with your one experience at a time. But when you're watching a lot of different people's experiences, you're better able to compare across the patterns that you see, and also where the challenges might have been and where something is usual versus unusual. However, the difficulty with vicarious experience is that you have what's called limited absorptive capacity. And simply put, that's just a fancy way of saying that when I don't have a lot of experience, sometimes it's hard for me to figure out what information is really important versus what's just part of the noise. So even though I can look at the information objectively, it's hard for me to prioritize it as really dominant, important information for my organization and stuff that should just be shelved for later. So in terms of these learning dimensions, I like to think of this as a soccer metaphor, where I explain to my students that when you're out in a field and you're playing soccer, right, you're not really learning the rules of the game. You are learning how to kick, how to move, how to interact with your teammates. You are learning what it takes to move yourself across the field, what the game actually feels like, all these things that are actually fairly difficult to explain. But it's when you're watching soccer that you really learn the rules of the game. So does everybody here know maybe a hardcore soccer baseball fan that probably knows more of the rules than the players themselves? Yeah? Like they know that guy is offside before the ref even calls it, right? It's because they've been vicariously learning that whole time. They're looking at it as a system, as pure information access. And this is exactly what is happening with these companies. When companies are experiencing, they're learning how to build relationships between their team members. They're learning how to build, how to do. But it's only when they're watching other companies that they're actually learning how does information transfer, what strategies work, what strategies don't work. It's a completely different type of learning that is just as useful. So in terms of how we predict our outcomes, I like to measure it in terms of what I call Cosmo Ambiguity, which is a way of saying what is the relationship between cause and effect and how fuzzy is that relationship. So when we have an unrelated industry, causal ambiguity is really high, because whether or not we had a success or a failure in that industry, it's hard for us to make a connection between the activities that we saw in the firm and the outcomes that we saw. But when it's a related industry that we're more familiar with, obviously our cognitive map is much more complete, and it's easier for us to take in that new information and add it to what we already know. Similarly, with a success experience, causal ambiguity is low, because we just keep on doing what we're doing. We go, I don't know a lot about the other possible paths, but I do definitely know that something in this path worked. Whereas with a failure experience, all we've been able to do is rule out one path amongst many. So what we predict is in these high causal ambiguity situations, direct experience is not going to be particularly helpful. It's going to be vicarious experience that's going to be significant in our data. However, with both high causal ambiguity and low causal ambiguity situations, vicarious experience can be helpful. So let's see if that actually played out. These are our hypotheses. Not surprisingly, we say that with cumulative experience, we think that direct experience is going to be helpful and vicarious experience is going to be helpful. And then when we look within experience type, comparing, say, direct success to direct failure, we think that success is going to be better than failure. So whether you're watching or doing, it is better to succeed. And related experience is also better than unrelated experience, whether you're watching or doing. Now, when you get across experience type, that's when it becomes really interesting. Here is where we're saying that vicarious failure is going to be better than direct failure. And that's going back to that causal ambiguity argument where vicarious failure is going to allow you to be doing a lot of comparisons at once, whereas direct failure is only going to tell you that one path didn't work. So these are our findings. You can see that direct experience and vicarious experience are both good, although interestingly, vicarious experience, when you standardize the results, is almost 3 times as good cumulatively as direct experience. And considering that vicarious experience was the bulk of our data, direct experience should actually have had a weighted advantage. So this is a pretty big finding, the strength of observational learning and how much it can help with performance improvements. When we look at success versus failure, it's not too surprising, given our theoretical predictions. Success is better than failure, and within failure, vicarious is better than direct. However, we have a little bit of a surprise in related versus unrelated. When you're looking at direct experience, related is better than unrelated, but when you're looking at vicarious experience, related is actually slightly worse than unrelated. Now, I think the reason for this is because when you are looking at an unrelated industry experience, which is the highest possible causal ambiguity, you get a bigger boost from vicarious learning than you would from other factors that we controlled for, right? Things like geography, staff pick, other things that would normally be coming into play. Whereas when you're in a related industry, those other factors in the analysis matter more. So the role that is played by vicarious learning in your performance outcome is a little bit less. But I'm also open to any other ideas that people might have, because this was a pretty surprising finding for us. So going back to that reverse murder mystery, in a nutshell, we've learned that entrepreneurs are unlikely to learn from their own failure. They do learn from the failures of others. Entrepreneurs learn from success, whether they experience it themselves or observe it vicariously. And where our cause and effect relationships to performance are fuzzy and ambiguous, it is way better for us to watch than to do. So going back to Kickstarter as a whole, I think it's kind of helpful to just consider these performance statistics. For the whole sample, funding success was on par with Kickstarter as a giant population in this category. It was 39%, and across Kickstarter, it's about 37%. But for projects whose creators had one launch, but they had never backed anything, their success was 40%. And then we compare it to projects where the creator has backed, but they've never launched anything, and their success is 50%. But then highest of all is that 10% of people who have that previous launch and that previous back, and their funding success is 66%. 2/3. So it just goes to show that by funding just one project, because that's what most of these people did before they launched a project, and experiencing just one project before they launched a project, people were able to very significantly raise their chance of funding success.
Question.
Yes?
When you mentioned you have a back in one project, are you talking about related business?
Oh, just in general.
That in general?
Yes. even if they backed any kind of project. Unrelated absolutely helped as well. So comparing this study to the prior literature, so this isn't often done in presentations, but I think it should be. We can see that there are some ways in which the findings are similar to what's been learned before, and some ways in which they're radically different. So most papers do say that we learn from direct success, which isn't very surprising. And then there are all these mixed results on whether we learn from direct failure. And I think that the reason for that is because most previous studies, when they're looking at catastrophic failure, are measuring things in a radically different way than what we're doing here. And the other thing to consider is that when you're looking at failure in isolation and you are not comparing it to success, you are much more likely to get a significant p-value. So there are a lot of studies where if they had compared both types of experience, they might not have found a significant result. Also, we say that you can learn from vicarious success, whereas most of the prior literature says no, that this is also the only study to determine that vicarious success is something other than just years of operating experience, but something concrete that you can say, this was a success, we got funded. And I think that that's one reason why our findings are significantly different, and I do think that they are much more generalizable. And then finally, all the literature agrees that we can learn from watching other people fail. So in the road ahead, we're going to try to consider whether we can compare at the time that these projects joined Kickstarter, they had a seed round previously or something that indicates that they were already an ongoing venture, even though everybody is still pretty early stage, versus people that were complete amateurs and Kickstarter was the first time that they did anything entrepreneurial. So I think it'd be really interesting to see how that impacts the learning results. Our belief is that the amateurs will get a much bigger learning boost from observational learning, even though the ones that are ongoing ventures will also learn that way. And then also, beyond funding success, it's important for us to consider, once you got funded on Kickstarter, were you actually able to deliver a product? Because although Kickstarter doesn't really like us to say this, 80% of the projects on Kickstarter do not deliver on time. And a fairly significant percentage never deliver at all. So I've been coding all of the successful projects that are in Gear, 790 of them, and figuring out what happened in their supply chain. Did they deliver successfully? If not, did they have something where they ran into a sourcing problem? If so, did they try to use a factory domestically or did they use it in China? Just trying to map out their path and what are the different junctures at which they could experience failure. And then when they get to the end, we're going even a step further and trying to figure out what are the broad categories that people can fail in. Is it going to be overall a supply chain failure? Is it going to be a communication failure where they didn't communicate expectations to the customer? Or, worst of all, is it going to be something where they were completely successful, but then they had what we call a category expectations failure? So this would be like something where you have a hoverboard and it looks exactly like the prototype on Kickstarter. Everybody is really, really happy. It comes on time, but it turns out that all your backers thought that this was going to be a personal hoverboard for them, but it comes and it's the size of a family sedan, which nobody expected, and now they're all really unhappy, even though by traditional measures, we should have called this a success. And this actually happens a lot more than you would think. There was a study that someone was telling me about recently with engagement rings, where it turned out that many engagement ring failures were due to the fact that on eBay, they came from what they call divorced conditions. It turns out that in that category, people do not want to buy engagement rings that have the stigma of divorce, even when the physical product itself is identical to another physical product, something that marketers would never have measured or expected. So going forward, I would love to hear your feedback as we try to measure the qualitative data and figure out how to quantify these different types of failure, and what's important for us when we're trying to figure out what are the ways that we measure performance beyond simple funding success and attracting capital. So if you have further questions, I would love to hear them.
First of all, thank you. And you could identify yourself just.
Hi, my name is Jessica Santana, and I'm a PhD student here in sociology. And I study learning from failure as well, so this is super exciting. So I'm trying to get a handle on how you compared the two groups, the groups that backed projects versus the groups that implemented projects. I'm wondering if there might be some factor that's biasing failure towards one group or the other. So, for example, if one group is maybe the number of projects they have, perhaps one group has more projects on average than the other, so they're more likely statistically to have a failure. So
You
how
mean
did
the group that watches versus the group that does?
Right. Well, in this case, it would be the other way around, given your findings. The group that does may just be, perhaps they're just trying out a lot of different ideas. They're throwing half-baked ideas out there that are more
Sure.
likely to fail. So how did you decide how comparable the two groups are?
So what we did was start by trying to figure out what is normal behavior and what is an outlier. So when we looked at people that launched, we tried to consider how strenuous is it to launch, how resource heavy. And we found that when people launch, they are very serious about it. Anything over 6 launches puts you into the top 0.2 percentile. So the possibility that people are just testing half-baked ideas on Kickstarter is pretty low. And I think that this is for a number of reasons. One is because you're destroying your future brand equity that way. You'd have to start a whole new username. That's a lot of energy as well. Your team would kind of have to rebrand. You don't want to be known as those people that have things that are half-baked and don't go anywhere. There are probably other ways in which you can test that out, such as entrepreneurial pitch competitions or things that just happen in the offline environment. And another reason is that you can see on Kickstarter pretty clearly what is going to lead to success. You can see that you need to have a clear product, that it needs to be up to the level where you probably have a prototype. There are lots of different metrics that you can try to understand, and that also lowers your incentive to just sort of test in that environment, because you can think of it as just being much cheaper to learn from the information that's already out there, right? Because testing is an information gathering expedition, but so is watching. Hopefully that answers some of that.
Yeah, thanks. It's wonderful to do research vicariously because we just watch you do the research and learn from it, which makes us better researchers. This is a sort of an unfair question because it's outside the scope of your research, but it's an important one, I think. So are we capturing the effect of an action, or are we capturing a type of person? A type of person who invests or who watches, pays a certain amount to watch others. That's the type of person who's more likely to succeed. Or is it, if you take the same hypothetical person and have them do this, they're more likely to succeed. If you're how does this lead to an action item? If Miyazama-san was an entrepreneur, should he go look at a bunch of unrelated fields to increase his success? Or if he's the type of person that's already looked at this kind of thing, he's more likely to succeed? You don't have to tell us if you did it. So, any thoughts of this? And obviously it's outside the scope of your research. So
No, that's a really great question, because that is kind of a chicken or egg kind of deal, right? Like when we talk about dynamic capabilities, we try to consider, are people born successful because of some sort of trait that they have, or is it something that's learned? So it's kind of a similar question here. Now, what I believe is that they are actually learning in this environment, that the types of people that back are within this category also the types of people that do. And that's a really important caveat, because in other categories that aren't so entrepreneurial, like say filmmaking, I think that fans are fundamentally different from people that are creatives, right? They have different personality traits. But frankly, this is the purview of engineers and nerds. And the people that watch are very similar to the people that do. When you are launching an Arduino project, the people that are getting really excited and they're going, my goodness, I would love to get that Arduino attachment. I can't wait to do something with it. These are makers. These are people that are going to their garage and they want to put the Arduino onto something else, and they are entrepreneurs kind of waiting to happen. So I think that when it comes to tech ventures, the line is pretty blurry between people who watch and people who do. And that's really nice for us because we can actually see by digging into the data that more and more over time, if people watch, they want to do. And if people do and they don't watch, then they're really not doing as well. Because we even did a robustness check. We were trying to see, okay, do we know that they're actually learning? Or is it just that they're kind of backing because my friend Bob, who's also an engineer and he also does 3D printing, we're pretty good buddies in the same community, so I'm just going to throw some money at his project, right? It could just be something like that, and our results could be just kind of a side effect. Well, we did a test to see whether the results are stronger when you comment. So if you're watching and then you also participate on the wall, if you're really learning, then the significance should go up, right? And similarly, if you're doing and you participate on your own wall and you actually talk to the people that are backing, again, your performance should be going up from the learning. And we find that it absolutely does.
Thank you. That's fascinating. So one word for people who are from big companies here who want to make in-house ventures more successfully. They should allocate a little budget to their team to go look at Kickstarter projects to increase the success of their likelihood, hopefully in unrelated areas. So that's a nice implication. And then we'll see if you're right or not.
I'm Chester. For as an investor, do you have any statistic to see how many percent are over 10% or over 20%, 50% over the bar, see, over the commitment. So people want to raise 100,000. Actually, how many percent are over those kind of? The reason is because maybe people set a bar too low. So you know what I mean? Just
You mean in terms of the funding goal
funding
or
goal,
the amount that they
funding
put in?
goal. If they set a funding goal is X dollar amount, but essentially, if you have statistics, see, actually, maybe there are 50% actually over. I mean, there are so many people over 50% their funding goal. So how do we set up the funding goal? That is my basically important question now.
There are a couple of interesting factors with the funding goal. If you try to set it too low so that your Kickstarter project will be successful, it backfires because then you do not look like a serious venture. If people can see that what you are trying to do is create, say, a portable 3D printer, but you've only asked for $5,000, then they know immediately that one of the following is true. You are unable to do that, or you are a very poor planner, or you have already done it and you are just looking for some supplemental backing from them and you don't really need the capital. And none of these is going to make them want to back you. So I believe that people typically do try to ask for the minimum amount that it will take for their project to actually succeed. So I don't know what, off the top of my head, I have it in my data. I don't know what the median levels of funding goals were, but I do know that since we cut off the bottom of the data set to get rid of people like that are just hobbyists, that at a very minimum, we are seeing projects that are trying to scale something that's like a small widget. So I guess an example at the lower end of something you can do with a minimum amount of funding would be something like this. Sorry, gotta go back here. So this project, the Spill Inator, I almost couldn't believe that it was in my gear category when I first saw it because it's a little widget that you put in your coffee cup. This is a tiny piece of metal and plastic. You can see a picture of it there, and all it does is prevent you from spilling. But in order for somebody to create this, they had to have a background in thermodynamics. They had to be something of an expert. But the project itself only required, what was it they asked for? $32,000 to produce at scale, because the actual product was probably really, really cheap. I didn't realize that something like that would get funded, because I didn't know that so many people spill their coffee all the time. But if you look at their wall here, you guys might get a bit of a kick out of it. Let's see. Sorry about that. I just went way too far here. But there are a lot of people on their wall saying things like, I have been waiting for a tiny product like this. I spill my coffee on myself every day. So even with something that's a small project, an incremental innovation, they now have a very successful company called something like SipTube, which is getting venture funding. But going back to Kenji's earlier point, one of the ways in which I think Kickstarter is very, very helpful is when we're trying to understand very nascent industries. So when I talk about category expectations failure, that often happens in industries where the expectations haven't been set yet. And Kickstarter is a place where these industries are getting defined. It's at the center of the making revolution, the people who are trying to think, where are drones going? Where is 3D printing going? And so I think that it's an important space for that. There's a reason why you don't see the semiconductor industry on Kickstarter, right? It's because that's a really established industry. But in these new niches where we don't even know what leadership in the industry looks like yet, I would say that vicarious learning on Kickstarter is pretty important for us to better understand how do we benchmark and what is it that these backers/customers are going to be expecting.
So you're saying an important part of this, for implications of this, is Kickstarter success in many domains is very similar to VC funding success.
Yes,
And
but
then
also
the-
market success.
Right.
So even with the example of 3D printing, one thing that people found on Kickstarter was that if your 3D printer is not compatible with different types of extrudable plastic, it's not going to do well with the backers. And that wasn't something that people would have predicted. Engineers thought you just need to make a 3D printer that works really well. It doesn't matter if it only works with one type of extrudable plastic because it works, right? And people are going to get the plastic from your supplier and they're going to prototype and they're going to be happy. But it turns out that people have very strong materials preferences that only come out when you can see that they got the product and then they're complaining. And for someone like me who's looking at all of the feedback on the wall, I'm learning as well. I'm going, oh, material sciences are just as important as the hardware. So lots of different areas that are very technical in which I wouldn't even have expected that we could learn from a platform like this. Yes.
I think I turned it off.
Is it on now? Hello? Is it on?
Yeah.
I'm Jen Snyder-Tonks. I'm in the EdTech space with a PhD in learning technology. And I'm wondering, you mentioned incubators, accelerators, and co-working spaces at the beginning and how they provide a place to learn from others. And I'm wondering if your data would allow you to control for that learning. So if you could pick out the companies that were in some of those environments and see if there was a significant increase in how successful they were, because most likely people in those environments are talking to their others about Kickstarter experience.
So that actually gets right to our study too, where we're trying to determine what had amateur status when it first entered Kickstarter and what was more like a venture. Currently with the data, I was unable to do that because it requires very difficult hand coding. But with that smaller group of successful projects, the 790, we go through one by one and we try to determine, did they have a presence on Crunchbase before? Were they on AngelList? because this is very highly correlated to them having some sort of incubator, accelerator relationship or being part of their portfolio company's network. I don't think that there's a significant difference between, say, an incubator program and a co-working space program. In fact, most of the incubators are now offering co-working spaces and vice versa anyway. But I do think that using databases like Crunchbase, we do have a way of knowing who's sort of part of that Silicon Valley or Silicon Alley in network and who is sort of brand new to the space. But unfortunately, the only way to do it is to check one by one. But it is an important question, so thank you.
Can I ask one more question? Would you say maybe Kickstarter is better for technology application, not for technology innovation, right?
Can you elaborate a little bit what you mean by technology applications versus innovation?
Innovation application basically you have most like a IP patent issue, this kind of thing. Application you have nothing to patent about it, just whatever's there, you just integrate it and use it. Innovation you involve a lot of really science, basic research, and the patent block the other competitors.
So I think that Kickstarter is best when you're not at the basic research component of your work, because it becomes very difficult to explain to the public or to a market what you're doing at that stage, and you also cannot predict a delivery date. So this is a big thing with Kickstarter, is that when you are asking for capital, you also have to be very clear on when the project would deliver. And we know that with basic science, it's impossible. It could be that we have a breakthrough very soon, or it could be years, which is why there have been other crowdfunding sites like experiments.com that have been trying to aggregate funding for those sorts of things. But actually, it's been very, very challenging. 2 years ago, there were 5 or 6 different platforms for basic science crowdfunding, and now there is only one in the US. And I think that that's a fundamental difficulty in trying to communicate to the public how does science translate into application. So Kickstarter is probably best when we already know how it applies and our innovation can take a physical space.
Do you have the correlation between delivery date and which the goal? Say, you promise to deliver in 3 months, you have a better success rate. Promise to deliver 1 year, you have much less success rate.
So what we actually see is an interesting curve. Now that wasn't in this study because it's our next 2 studies that look at delivery dates, but from the data that I've already looked at, if your delivery date is very close, you are very likely to reach your delivery date, probably because you're already really far ahead. You're already past the prototype stage, and really all you needed this funding for was to scale. A typical situation would be something where you already had maybe a domestic manufacturer and you did a small beta batch, like maybe 100 products, and what you're trying to do on Kickstarter is go to China and manufacture 10,000 at once. And so in that case, since you're basically at that last step, that small delivery window is an indicator of your readiness. But then, when we're looking at something like 6 months out, 7 months out, now you're getting the people that were just optimistic and did poor planning. And so now you're seeing a huge spike in people that didn't deliver. So it kind of goes low where you don't have too many failures, and then lots and lots and lots of failures, and then kind of an up down, because you have 2 different populations where there's some people who said, I'm going to deliver next year, and it's because their planning was excellent. And there's some people who said, I'm going to deliver next year because at this point, I don't even have a prototype, and I'm just hoping that you'll believe in me. So what we have to do is find a meaningful way in the data to separate the populations and analyze them separately.
That's for the delivery, but if you promise a shorter period of delivery, do you have a better chance to reach the funding goal?
No.
No.
And I think that this is because when people are choosing products on Kickstarter, what they're thinking is this cool? They don't actually expect to get it very soon because they've been conditioned that they'll have to wait. For them, if they were going to get something in a couple months, that would be like a huge bonus. Because as someone who's backed things in Kickstarter myself, I never expect to get anything earlier than 6 months. But
Great. Well, oh, sorry.
again, everything that I'm saying is true of the tech category in Kickstarter and probably other early stage ventures as well. But I don't really know how the larger world of Kickstarter operates because the art stuff, the film stuff, the comic books, these are basically just different areas of research. So I guess I'm just saying, don't blame me if the findings don't generalize to, say, tabletop games.
Well, thank you so much. We have until 6 o'clock for the room, so please network and become friends with each other. Jackie will be around, and she'll be around for the rest of the year, so please use her as a good resource to whatever you want. And again,
I'm just
thank
putting
you.
my email address up, so yep, there we go.
Great.
Took forever to get to that.
Please join us in thanking Jackie.
Thank you.